Hello and welcome to Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and I'm your host for this program, which is designed to give all of us a little more insight into what goes on in and around our capital and the people who are making things happen in our government and around our government. Our guest today is a gentleman who is heavily involved in the prison work program. He's new to this process and new to the Department of Corrections, Michael Taaffe. Welcome aboard.
Thank you, Kevin.
What we try to do on Capital Insight is give folks a little bit of information about you as a person and what your background is, and then we try to move on over into issues that you're involved in government. Can you tell us a little bit about where you hail from? Pretend this is a job interview and I was trying to ask you where you're from.
I grew up in Salem for the most part, although I can't claim to be a native Oregonian. And I have degrees from Oregon State University in Corvallis. I've worked previously in two state agencies in Salem, the Department of Agriculture and the Economic Development Department, as well as been in private business in and around the state.
Now, what kind of work did you do for these two state agencies?
In both instances, I worked with private business. At Agriculture, I was international marketing representative and worked with primarily, of course, our agricultural firms in the state to assist them in getting products into particularly Pacific Rim countries. And then with the Economic Development Department, spent a great deal of time recruiting companies to the state and helping businesses who are already here expand their business.
Now, what made you choose this direction, this kind of work, in terms of agriculture, the commodities, and in terms of economic development, that sort of thing?
Well, I have a degree in agriculture from Oregon State Universities, and that was a natural interest of mine. And I had the opportunity to couple that with a similar interest in international activity, so that was a very good fit. As far as economic development goes, I had learned a great deal when I was at agriculture, and I had gone to work for an electric utility in between there and going to economic development. But I had so much business background and had dealt with so many companies, both in the state and out of the state, that again it was a natural progression to continue to deal with in government, but with private sector.
So how long has it been since you took your degree and have been doing all of this now?
Oh gosh, I've been doing this for close to 15 years, I guess.
You're married?
Married. I have one young son, and we live here in Salem.
And how long have you actually lived in Salem?
I first came to Salem as a child in 1960 and left as our family moved. My father was rotated on a job to Arizona for 3 years. We came back in 1967, and I've been here ever since, other than taking a few jobs in other areas of the state.
Did you go to high school in Salem?
I did. I went to North Salem High School.
So you're a North Salem graduate.
I am indeed.
I'm sure there's a lot of listeners who can tune into that notion. Now, let me take you back now to more recently what's happened. You've been appointed Director of the Prison Industries Program. Can you describe your title and the job that you've just been put into?
I am Administrator of the inmate work programs for the Corrections Department, and that essentially is the individual responsible to implement what was Ballot Measure 17 and has since become constitutional amendment for the state.
Now, this job seems to be something, would seem to be a bit of a challenge when you're dealing with 8,000 inmates and the constitutional requirement now that they be put to work full time. What have you encountered as you've started to deal with this issue? And technically your title is Administrator of Inmate Work Programs.
That's correct.
What are you running into, and how long have you been in this job now?
I've been in the job almost a month, and it certainly will be a challenge for all the obvious reasons, but for reasons that are probably not as obvious to the general public as well. You're talking about, through the acceptance of Ballot Measure 17, the will on the part of the general population of the state to put these folks to work in a culture that has been directed to toward public safety And the Department of Corrections is a very, very large organization of state government. And overnight, through ballot measure 17, we have changed the culture from not only public safety. Now public safety is just number one of two major themes, of course, public safety, and then put the folks to work. So putting the folks to work has changed that culture inside, and the corrections culture has to adjust to, while maintaining public safety, be able to accommodate the fact that these people need to have daily routines.
It's interesting that you talk about the culture and the change because, for example, as we're now talking about prison construction, I've been a legislator for 8 years, and in the earlier days when we were talking prison construction, they talk about siting and land use planning and all of that. Never talked about the work programs or rehabilitation programs, which were always there in the background, but were a very small part of the operation. Now, as we're dealing with prison siting for some additional prison construction in Oregon, one of the chief components of the discussion is, well, will this be a site that's accessible to the community so that if we have work programs, we can do things? Will the site be usable for, say, putting in an industrial operation if that's necessary? It sounds like the institution is starting to respond now and understand that there's a new dynamic. What's your perception on that?
They are starting to deal with that change of culture, and really an assist to them, and it's, I guess, an unfortunate one, is we have to build a number of new prisons in the state. And that helps the culture change because we have to design prisons for the future, of course, not for the past. And as we design new institutions, it's easier to accommodate those kinds of changes where the physical layout and the physical infrastructure of the institution is better able to accommodate, for instance, private partnership where businesses actually are engaged with us in putting those folks to work.
Now, you've talked about some of the impediments to putting prisoners to work, and maybe we ought to elaborate a little bit on that. Are we dealing with a typical workforce? I'm stating a pretty obvious question here. It's a nice soft pitch to you to tell us about what the differences are in terms of the workforce we have here.
You're not dealing with a usual workforce. There are certainly individuals within the correction systems who are skilled, and in some cases very skilled in technical areas. However, the general population is what we would call fairly unskilled labor, untrained, and in some cases even lacking basic skills such as reading and writing capabilities. So all of those things enter into our ability to deliver a workforce to an outside employer. It's easier in the sense when we employ them ourselves in the system, but if there's a recognition and a demand that they produce like a workforce that you or I would hire on the outside of the walls, then we inside are going to have to either group those skilled individuals together, which has not been the culture in corrections, or train folks to deliver for, let's say, a private employer who makes his or her living by meeting deadlines and producing quality of goods and customer service.
Now, as we deal with these inmates, Measure 17, as we still generally refer to it, it is now a constitutional amendment, allows you to consider a variety of factors and allows you to provide for up to 20 hours a week of education or on-the-job training as components of the work program. Do you see the work programs incorporating this kind of on-the-job training and education?
Absolutely. In fact, that's my personal philosophy, and it is shared by the director of the department, and probably was the determining factor in whether they hired me for this position or whether they hired another individual. And I firmly believe that this whole Measure 17 implementation is not what I would call a rock-breaking exercise for inmates. It's a philosophy that I want to take the program is that we build the program through a combination of education and graduated work opportunities within the system, so that the inmates, prior to their release, and realizing, Kevin, that right now 95+% of these individuals who are incarcerated in the state will go back to their communities at some point in time. So while they're there, we intend to, through education and work training, bring them through a graduated steps, or a number of graduated steps, so that prior to their release, they are reasonably well trained in a job, and reasonably well educated to support that job, and reasonably cultured to understand that the job environment today means that you're not sitting over in a corner doing a repetitive job by yourself, but that you are able to interact with a group of people, and they're the group dynamic in business. You don't always get your way, but you get the job done.
I'm going to pause for a moment and mention to our audience that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem. I'm your host. Our guest today is Michael Taaffe. He is the administrator of the inmate work programs for the Department of Corrections. If you ever have any questions or concerns or comments, feel free to write to me at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon 97310. You can also call me at my law firm. Since we're citizen legislators, we do have our private offices, and that phone number in Salem is 364-1913. I do ask that you mention when you call that it's a legislative matter, so that my law staff will know to put it through to me. Since they're there to do law work, I'm the only one there who does the political work. In any event, we always welcome your comments and questions and concerns. Turning back to you, Michael, you're new to this job. You're coming in. Measure 17's been in effect for over a year. Corrections hired a lot of folks and brought them in and sent them out to all the institutions under Measure 17. What are you trying to do to work with the people that are already in corrections on this program?
The people that are already in corrections have had, of course, some direction, and early corrections department decided that they had to graduate into the implementation of this, and I think it was reasonably sensible. And they first looked at their own institutions and said, how can we put people to work within our institutions that help us comply with the mandates of Measure 17? And then take one step beyond that and look at how can we employ folks in support of other state agencies and other government bodies that help us comply. And again, graduating, then how can we help folks through our industries program, and we can talk about that a little bit later in the program, to comply. And then once again graduating, how can we work with the private sector to help meet the mandates of 17 and provide real service to folks in the business community? So the Department of Corrections started at square one, of course, and that was within institutions. So they did hire or appoint a number of people that were already in the system to implement 17 and to look within our own institutions how they could reconfigure activities so that they could put the maximum number of people to work doing jobs that meet the necessary requirements of 17.
How are things going inside corrections in terms of that implementation program?
I think from an outsider's point of view, if I ask people on the street, they would say that they really don't know because there hasn't been a lot of discussion about how, and we're guilty of that at corrections. We haven't been telling the story very well about what we are doing. But how it really is going is that compliance is about 50% of the inmate population today.
Meaning 50% are in work or education
Are in work or education programs, 50% of the eligible population in the institutions. But you have to look at where they started. Corrections was employing people long before 17 came along. And I don't know what that base number was, but let's say it was 30%. So we've made some steps to to get to 50%, but frankly, it's going to take a great deal of work to get from 50% to 100%. The kinds of employment activities that we have seen to date have been employing 2s and 3s and 4s of inmates, and 10s and 20s have been the very large groups. Well, unless we're employing 10s and 20s a day in new employment opportunities, we're not going to be able to keep up with the inmate population that comes into the system.
So as far as this goes, what's been done to date has its limited expansion capability, and you've just about filled that bucket, so to speak.
That's correct.
And you've got to create some new, or find some additional buckets to work with. What sort of directions are you moving in now in trying to find those other buckets?
I am looking at expanding our industries program, and I say that's sort of a couple of tiers up. The easy compliance activities have been substantially discovered and taken care of and filled. And as we build new institutions, of course, we have a system that we can fill those jobs with as well. So for large expansion, we have to look at our existing industries program, which we can expand. We're in the garment manufacturing business. We make furniture. We make metal products. We run a fairly sizable laundry business. We do some CAD/CAM operations. And we have a telephone answering service, and we work for the Secretary of State and the Department of Motor Vehicles in answering public information phone calls.
In that industries program, we probably ought to emphasize a good deal of what's done there is within government and for government.
That's correct.
Although there is some marketing in the private sector. For instance, you're not setting up a bunch of dry cleaning establishments around the state saying we're going to take in your cleaning, but you're doing your laundry operation provides laundry services for government entities.
It does.
Now, what sort of expansion are you looking at in terms of those prison industries programs?
Well, for instance, our furniture factory has probably been one of the longest running operations that the system has had. It does currently produce about 40% of its product for the retail bedroom furniture market, and has historically been distributed through distributors and to some small direct furniture companies. The other 60% has been government support. That is one that's probably reasonably mature, other than adjusting, for instance, in our government where we make desks, chairs, tables, to be a better customer service entity for those government agencies, and perhaps marginally expand that business in a business such as CAD/CAM, where we do, again, a lot of government support work. That is not a mature business. We have not been in that business for a long, long time, and there's a great deal of work that continues to need to be done.
Could you explain what CAD/CAM means?
I'm sorry. It's an acronym for computer-aided drafting and computer-aided mapping. And we do a fair amount of computer-aided mapping in support of government agencies such as the Water Resources Department.
Now, in terms of the prison industry program, and you mentioned the furniture factory, we've had a conversation before where I've said, for instance, why shouldn't the state government, which now funds 70% of the local education effort, say to the schools, we're going to devise some basic plans working with you for school desks, and we'll now say that your prime source for school furniture ought to be prison industries, since this is a way of saving taxpayers money and putting inmates to work. Are those kinds of ideas being devolved and developed now in prison industries?
They are. And I guess my preference going into an activity like that is not to mandate it, for instance, to the school districts, but to be able to comfortably offer it to them first of all. If push comes to shove down the road and it makes sense to direct them to do that, that's probably not going to be my decision, but it is important for me, and it's my responsibility to make sure the furniture factory can respond to those customers.
And I'd pause here and say, actually, yes, the mandate would be the cop-out, because then you wouldn't be necessarily producing the best possible product at the lowest possible price.
That's correct.
What you want to do is be able to offer a line of product to the schools and say, look at these wonderful desks, look how cheap they are, this is your taxpayers' dollars going to put inmates to work, and you can now save taxpayers' dollars for your school district by buying desks here, say 50, I'll make this up, 50% cheaper than from the private market. Now, when I say that, we need to distinguish between prison industries competing within government as opposed to competing out there with private industry. One of the lines we've drawn is we've said when you're saving taxpayers' dollars as to government operations, it should be no holds barred. Do whatever you can. Now, the side to be sensitive on is when you go out into the private market and compete with private entrepreneurs within the private sector, selling to the private sector. There's always a concern there that prison industries will just go out and suddenly undercut all the competition and be able to sell things cheaper and undermine the private market. How do you respond to that?
Well, I would use an example. We do that. We have a blue jeans factory in Pendleton, and we manufacture and sell blue jeans. We manufacture and sell considerably less than 1% of the blue jean market in the world. And in fact, we would have to have 10 factories to produce 1%. So while we compete in the private market in that garment business, we are such a pea in an ocean of that universe of retail product that we're unnoticed. And yet, that's a well-run operation for us. It's a profitable operation. It's one we would like to expand, and again, we could expand it 5 times and still be unnoticed in that market. So there are those opportunities. There are other instances where we have to be much more careful because there are industries in Oregon, for instance, that we could compete with, probably should not compete with, because it would undermine their viability as an industry.
And for instance, prison blues is fairly unique in Oregon. It's not like we have a major manufacturing industry in this state producing denim.
That's correct.
But if you were to go into producing electronic wafers or whatever, or some sort of electronic components that are being produced by the high-tech folks, you'd suddenly be competing with major Oregon industries. And there's your sensitivity point.
There's a sensitivity point, and that's where we would like to either be in business with them or produce a product for them, or just simply not compete in that market.
Now, when you talk about being in business with them, how do you put together those kinds of partnerships?
That's the last tier as we talk through, and that's private partnership. And I have some experience putting those kinds of projects together, of course, with the Economic Development Department, where it was sort of creative structuring to get business activities to happen in the state. So I think that I have some background to do that. We have to first, of course, uncover some viable partners in viable industries that make good economic sense, and get them, of course, to get familiar with and understand and know what sort of production that they can expect from an inmate workforce. It's an unknown commodity in the private sector, and I think in some respects it's an unknown commodity within corrections. Can we in fact assemble a workforce that is productive enough for a private partner that it encourages them to be in business with us?
Well, you'll have a lot of challenges along that front. In the short term, do we have a situation where you might be able to help with labor shortages that exist, say, in the Willamette Valley? I'm thinking about canneries trying to have enough crews to run the canneries at the peak of the season, or farmers having enough people to pick crops. Are you taking a look at those kinds of options?
We are, and we have. Prior to my coming, in fact, we had been discussing the issue of providing crews for instance, a graveyard shift at a local cannery. That hasn't gone anywhere to date, but those discussions are not closed, and the need still remains. There are some challenges that both of us have to work through to accomplish that, but I'm a believer that will in fact happen in the future, and it may not be this season, it may not be next season, but ultimately you will see us supporting where there is a need, local business.
We've only got a few minutes to go, and I'll turn to our audience for a moment and mention you are with us on Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix, your host. Our guest today is Michael Taaffe. He is the administrator of the inmate work programs in the Department of Corrections. If you ever have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to write to me at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. Also, if there's something of immediate concern, you can call me at my law firm at 364-1913. I always mention a disclaimer there. We are citizen legislators, so that when we're not in session, our local offices just have to serve both purposes. But that is the number you can reach me at, but do mention it's a legislative matter. Turning back to the correction situation, and we were just talking about canneries and picking crops, that sort of thing. A citizen would ask, well, why can't we do this fairly quickly? What are the concerns that arise in terms of sending out a crew of inmates?
The primary concern, of course, is public safety, and that still is corrections' #1 responsibility. So, although we are mandated to find work opportunities for these individuals, and we will do that, we cannot violate the mandate of public safety and the responsibility of being the #1 public safety entity for these folks. So that is a challenge when you're taking people outside of a closed perimeter and you introduce so many variables into the equation of, are they going to get away, are they going to hurt somebody, those sorts of things. Because it's a new challenge for corrections, it's a difficult one for them to grip, but they've made great strides in coming to grips with that. In fact, I think have begun to move mountains. And we are getting work crews out all over the state from our minimum security institutions, and they're doing tremendous amount of community work, parks, cleanup. The projects are almost endless.
Do you think those endless projects themselves will help provide part of the answer to what we find for inmates to do in terms of inmate work programs?
I do believe they will.
How about state parks? Are you folks taking a look at expanding the use of inmates to help maintain those parks?
We are, in fact. We've had initial discussions with state parks, and I hope that we can package a fairly novel, long-term solution to some of the state parks' problems as far as maintenance and repair go.
Well, we only have about a minute left. Is there any parting thought you'd like to leave with us about where we're heading with all of this?
Oh, that's a tough one, Kevin. Yes, I think that the Department of Corrections I would say, is very committed to this. They hired me realizing that they had some difficulty, that this may not be as easy, and I guess they never thought that it was going to be easy, but they had some challenges that even they internally didn't expect, and that sort of grew on them. They asked me to come in and see if I could give them a long-term focus, and I think that's the difference. They had a short-term focus about taking care of this.
I'm going to have to interrupt you then and say we look forward to you continuing to develop that long-term focus, and we hope the folks in our audience will focus on what happens in the future with prison work programs. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Kevin.